The communists in the media are working overtime trying to push the importance of big pharmaceutical solutions, even though they have not been properly tested. Well, this sounds like another money grab, and maybe they don't have our best interests at heart. Joining us now is Robert Scott Bell, who's been keeping his eye on this Big Pharma for us.
Thanks again, Michael. Always great to be with you and the Savage Nation audience, especially when we can get the message of liberty out to even more people. And, you know, whenever health freedom is assaulted, and whether it's by government officials or those in the polluted, toxic, pharmaceutically conflicted mainstream media, we take it head on and set the record straight. Now, this could be because it's Nancy Pelosi talking or Kathleen Sebelius from the Department of Health and Human Services. It could be Chris Matthews. It doesn't matter to us. But this week I actually had to bring up an unnamed radio doctor, let's just call it that, a veteran of Health Talk Radio that I sometimes refer to as the Edsel. But it's time to ruffle the pharmaceutically encrusted feathers of this so-called self-proclaimed America's doctor, because he went after physician's assistants, pharmacists, and nurses, RNs and nurse practitioners.
What? Why?
Because their flu vaccination rates were not up to snuff to him, not as much as the medical doctors. In other words, he was saying that he was really pleased. The medical doctors all want to get their flu shots, but he's just questioning, how is it that nurses and they're not as enthusiastic about getting their annual flu shot? And he actually brought up that they might not be able to think. They may be dumb. And I just think this is really outrageous. They've got loads of education. They have the ability to scan the journals, the publications, and maybe even read the inserts. As you know, now you get free flu shots with photo processing at your corner drugstore.
Mm-hmm.
The questioning that is going on out there, because remember, with all the propaganda of the swine flu scam of 2009, we covered that many times. The fact is that they went so far overboard in their reaction and their promotion of shots for everybody without really looking at the science involved. And now we're finding out that this year's flu shot, which has already been given in Australia because of their season is opposite to ours, more and more children reacting horribly with seizure disorders, Guillain-Barré, things like this. We're finding it exists, and yet no questioning is allowed from our government officials, the bureaucratic oligarchy at the CDC, the FDA. And I think it's only reasonable to ask questions to read inserts.
Well, that's because we're not supposed to question this administration.
Yeah, I know this unthinking and this unquestioning thing, that to me really flies in the face of liberty. It really flies in the face of individual liberty, this idea that we can assess things, whether we have degrees or not, whether we have licenses or not, and basically decide what we want to do with our health, with the health of our children. Yet you've got these arrogant, sometimes MD-ities, and I joke with my MD buddies, you know, they talk about this, where the ego overwhelms even their education, that can no longer think clearly. And in the case of so-called America's doctor, he likes to say, well, how dare 62% of all Americans are actually questioning the flu shot, some linking vaccines to autism, which we know is a controversy out there, but then he adds on, and side effects, that they actually think there are side effects. And anybody with a lick of sense can open up an insert, can read the studies, and know that there are always potential side effects to flu shots. Very real and very rational that Americans are asking these questions as they're rushing in and mandating it, so-called, for more and more Americans, which brings to rise, your concepts and trickle up poverty that so much of the left, so much of the Obama administration is doing whatever it can to dumb down the masses to accept things. In fact, while certain doctors may question your ability to question, you have people like Bill Clinton hitting the stump and trail for some of these Democratic candidates, and he actually went out in support of scary Harry Reid.
Let's play a clip.
You and I know that the only reason this is a tough race is that this is a tough time. And when people are having a tough time and they're frightened and they're confused and they're mad, it's hard to think.
This is unbelievable to me.
So what we have are elitists, largely, and it's not exclusive to the left, because we're now hearing that some of the Republicans in the Senate are actually telling their donors that they're not going to repeal Obamacare, that they just want to massage it and manage it and modify it. which tells me that the Tea Party really has got to do some work here in making sure the candidates they put up into office are willing to go on principle and stand by those principles and not become enmeshed in this big government liberal conservative, which we couldn't call it truly conservative, but if we can call it a conspiracy to grow government just so long as they remain in power.
I've been saying all along that the Tea Party shouldn't let either party tell them what to do.
Well, exactly, because we see the elitists in the GOP are fully embracing big government, bureaucratic oligarchy takeovers of freedom, and that's, the horrendous passage of Obamacare. Even though they stood against it, the reality was not well enough because they passed it, and now that so-called mandate is in place that you can't even say no, which, of course, we know there are a lot of court challenges. Last week, we acknowledged there was a federal judge in Detroit that said, there's no basis for the suit. But now we hear a federal court judge in Florida says, yes, indeed, there are legitimate constitutional challenges, which is another thing you've covered about the fact that they went in and say, no, it's not a tax, it's a penalty. So if you don't participate, it's a penalty. But once it was passed, in order to defend its constitutionality, they simply changed their mind and said, Obama says, it's a tax now. Yep, it's a tax. So wave their magic wand of sorcery, and it becomes whatever the heck they want it to say and be.
The left has been denying the truth for years. It doesn't matter to them.
Now, I realize that there are some, elitist doctors that don't like health freedom. I mean, again, many of my friends in the medical profession are all endorsing health freedom because they want to see the costs come down and legitimately people getting well again. But certain docs, unfortunately, some in media, a lot in media, in fact, are just they just say, well, you don't have a right. You shouldn't have a right to have health freedom to get ripped off and scammed. And I'm thinking, you know how many hundreds of thousands of Americans a year are being ripped off and scammed by government-sanctioned medicine?
Exactly.
So you don't have a right for freedom, but you have a right or an obligation to be enslaved to Obamacare, which only endorses and strengthens that monopoly, which is so dangerous, not only to the health and life of the people, but also that stifles innovation, discoveries that could genuinely be reversing a lot of these diseases, and many of which, in fact, are now acknowledged to be man-made.
Why do you say that?
There's a story out of took samples, tissue samples from mummified mummies, basically from ancient Egypt, and there was no cancer. They didn't have cancer, and they were living long too. And indicative of the fact that we've just abandoned all logic and common sense in nutrition, looking at everything as drug deficiencies, like we all need more pesticides in our diet, and it does nothing in a vacuum, no cancer. And of course, recognizing now that man's arrogance is participating in the creation of disease, for which then we fall into the Obamacare monopoly of the only ones that can treat the disease, as opposed to the Americans that are waking up, reading your books, for instance, on nutrition, and learning that the power to heal is indeed theirs.
Just further proof that liberals do not want people to empower themselves with natural medicine.
Yeah, and the left is really worshiping science as if it were religion. It's something called scientism, and it isn't real science. It's not legitimate science. It's scientism, a belief system. They don't question it. They don't want you to question it. And just like the 20th century father of propaganda, Edward Bernays, so at the beginning selling pianos by selling music rooms, now the pharmaceutical drug manufacturers are selling drugs by selling the diseases they treat. Coming back to your classic example of statin drugs to reduce a life-sustaining fat in the body known as cholesterol, which is very protective of health and life and neurological health.
Right.
And yet there is legitimate science happening out there.
Well, what is that?
There's a new story coming out of the UK in the Mail Online that's covering a new study. They talk about addressing the norovirus, the common cold. They say, there's no cure for the common cold. But now scientists are looking back to nature. They're looking back to trace minerals, trace elements. And they're finding that scientists are injecting friendly bacteria, good bacteria, with silver nanoparticles, and they're wiping out the norovirus. This is happening on cruise ships everywhere, and it's the cold virus. It's very annoying, and yet they're doing this. But, what's interesting is that people around the world knew this for thousands of years and have access to it. And my fear is that under Obamacare, again, under a monopoly, that they'll try to synthesize, patent, and limit the people's access to this knowledge or the utilization of this information, which is readily available within the natural products industry, for instance.
Well, this just shows that there is still hope out there.
Yes, there is absolutely still hope, as the people are questioning more and more, not less and less, as the boot, if you will, of Obamacare is just weighing down. And if the elitist, establishment Republicans aren't willing to reverse it, then of course the Tea Parties and those that have principles, that movement will only grow and grow and grow. As I mentioned before, interviewing Michael Steele a few weeks back, he acknowledged too that if the Republicans say something and they do the opposite this time, they are toast, and deservedly so.
Where can we read more?
I'd love for the Savage Nation audience to come visit me at robertscottbell.com. In fact, there's a very interesting video presentation I did at the 10th Amendment Center's Nullify Now, which talks about the vital importance of health freedom to the very life of the Republic. And I think this will add a lot to the good works you're doing here on radio, Michael.
Well, thanks for the report, Robert.
Thanks again for having me on, Michael. I really appreciate it.
That's why I wrote Trickle Up Poverty. Our security is under attack on many levels, and I document it clearly in my book.